Welcome to LOA Today. I'm Walt Thiessen.
With me today is abundance teacher and money coach, Jody Lynn Craven.
This is your daily dose of happy. We are so happy you decided to join us today.
Okay, everybody, it's story time because we have a wonderful storyteller joining us today. She's a children's author, and her latest book, Hard Camp, is a great indication of the kind of work that she does. But we're going to get to know a little more about her in just a moment. But first, Jody Lynn, I was kind of overhearing the conversation that you and Steph were having before we got started there. Do I gather that you're actually not completely freezing to death there in Alberta right now?
Not completely. No, it's cold, but mild for February.
Wow. Mild.
Yeah.
Canada, mild. Those aren't words you have in the same sentence very often where weather is concerned.
I think it really comes down to perspective because as I was telling Steph, she was thinking that is not mild. I think her expression showed that.
This is true. Yes. What are you used to? That makes a big difference. It does make a huge difference. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, well, anyway, I'm glad that it's milder than usual. It means you can actually go outside occasionally. I mean, compared to thought. Yes.
Yeah.
Very, very occasionally. Right.
Yes. Yeah. With many layers.
With many layers. Yes. That's the secret living with a cold. Layering covers almost any scenario. Yeah. Good stuff. So anyway, Steph Katzovi is a children's author, and she's joining us today to just talk about all the kinds of things we like to talk about. But Steph, you mentioned that you listened to some episodes, so we usually start by finding out more about the guest. So the spotlight is now on you. Tell us about Steph.
Well, there's so many ways I could answer the question, but I think I'll go with a little bit about me, that I'm a writer, a mother of 2 school-age boys, and a wife to a very extroverted husband. He's the polar opposite of me. As the introverted, naturally quiet and reserved writer, it's funny that I found someone that's just, can walk into a room and be quite comfortable talking to anyone. Me, it takes a little while to warm up, but I'd like to think that I have a good sense of humor. And I'll note, although no, I'm not resting on my laurels, but in 8th and 12th grade, I was voted both class clown and best sense of humor.
Ooh.
Yes. So that kind of fueled me through college and law school. But I think after law school, I spent the bulk of my career as a professional writer. I worked in corporate communications for many years. And now I consider myself incredibly fortunate to have the opportunity to live my childhood dream of being an author while also raising my children.
That's terrific. I like that. I have to admit, I'm also a little surprised. I don't think I've ever heard of an introverted class clown before.
Well, that's the weird thing, I'm sorry, I thought I turned the phone off. It's live work for you. Yeah, it takes me a while to warm up, but when I do, I guess I don't turn off. So,
I guess. Yeah. I mean, because the class, as I remember anyway from school, the class clown was the one who was always looking for attention. And that's not really what an introvert normally does. So that's why it's so interesting.
No, I think I was more of I was a punctuation mark. Like I was providing that added layer of something, if something was funny, I was going to find a way to draw that out. So I sort of like a background player that would pop in and out. Or I just went to a very small school. I don't know.
Well, possibly both. But you provided the rim shot is what you're saying.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. You got it. Perfect.
Jody Lynn, were you ever a class clown? Were you ever that kind of person in class?
No. I mean, yes and no, sort of. I'm also introverted, but I think that once you crack me open, you can't shut me up. I'm the same way, Steph.
Yeah.
And I think I was always by default the quieter one because my brother was the class clown and literally a rodeo clown from 8 until 20 something. So he got that role pretty easily, and I was in his shadow in that way. I'm not as funny as he is.
Well, since we have a panel of introverts here, because I was definitely an introvert when I was growing up, I will say this. I think that the reason introverts want to talk is that we have a whole lot more to say.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're right.
That's just my bias, but I think that's
true.
Yeah.
But if you take the class clown best sense of humor angle, you have to know the right time and place to say it.
Yes.
And I think being the introvert, you're aware and you've got a lot of that sensitivity to reading the room. I live in a house with three extroverts. My kids and I all fight to see who can talk the most, I think. And I usually am the loser, never a sore loser. I love hearing from them. But, I think the key with them is that they haven't yet realized, like, when should they not be talking? Whether it's, at school, I have, the feedback is that they're great kids, but love to talk. And I think, they got that from my husband, because I knew exactly how to, give that funny rim shot, but do it at just the right moment, so I never got in trouble. I was a very, studious child.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's good. That's good. Well, I'll also say there's something in favor of the extrovert here, because the extrovert is basically in school when they're school age. They are trying to do the kind of growing that I think all kids really need to do. Yeah, it doesn't really fit in nicely with what the teacher has in mind, but quite honestly, I think there's more value to be gained from the socializing than there is from what the teacher is teaching. I mean, that's my prejudice, perhaps. And you can tell I don't really have a really high belief factor in public education, but there's so much more to be gained, because that's where, among other things, that's where kids are gaining their self-confidence, their self-esteem.
That's true.
Through those social interactions. It's vitally important. So anyway,
and if that's the biggest problem I have with my kids at school, I guess, that's a pretty good problem to have.
Yeah, that's not
they
much
like
of a
to
problem,
talk and they participate. So,
Yeah. I mean, it's actually harder to deal with the introvert who's really severely introverted, because you're constantly trying to draw them out of their shell.
Right. And that's why there's so many people that become writers, I think, because it's the best way to express yourself, and you could do it really quietly behind, a desk or a computer.
Yeah. Yeah. Nobody ever sees the writer, right?
That's true. Like, my kids wonder what I do all day. It was when my book came out that they're finally like, oh, mommy has a talent. She doesn't just, make sure things get done around the house and make sure we get to places and do all the other millions of things that parents juggle. So that was very rewarding for me.
No kidding.
So where do you get your inspirations from when you're writing your books?
Well, I think I take a lot of it from my own childhood, because, as the saying goes, you have to write what you know. But my kids, I have two boys, one's 12 and one's 10. And so they're at just the age for the kids that I write about. And I find that, again, being a good listener, they're like a gold mine of stories. And, I look at everything in life with a sense of humor. So to see, what they're going through and what the spin is on how I could make it relatable but funny, it really is like, I have one book that I am finishing up the edits on. I have ideas for a third book. And, like, if they continue to be who they are, I could have, an indefinite number of books to write about. But, it's really amazing just what sort of comedic gold they share without even realizing it.
It's true. True comedy, really good comedy, seems ordinary and everyday.
Yeah, I think that's, like the show Seinfeld, it was so popular because these things, you don't appreciate the humor of it until someone takes the time to point it out in a much more clever way than, you probably digested it initially.
Right.
I can aspire to be at that level of comedic humor, but something to work for and work towards.
Yeah. Well, if you're already successful as a children's book author, you've achieved it to a certain degree. So pat yourself on the back for the achievement, because that's not easy. That's not easy to do.
No, I think for me, the hardest part when I left my job in corporate America was, I looked at the walls of where I was working, and nobody was waiting for this book that I was writing. And it was a little bit scary, frankly, because you go from a world of deadlines and you need to get things done to a world where you have endless amounts of time and the schedule is yours to make or break. And, for me, I'm a very disciplined person. So ultimately I figured out my footing, but I can imagine just having that sense of, what can I do now? Oh, there's a closet to clean or some laundry to do. Or, and it's easy to get distracted. So, for me, I was really dedicated to finishing what I'd started. And so I'm glad that I did. And I'm glad that I'm able to move on to a second book and hopefully more.
Yeah. So what made you go from, you were in corporate America, were you a lawyer?
I never practiced law. I was one of those people that went to law school and decided pretty early on that the practicing attorney role was not for me. I don't know if my parents were disappointed or at least appreciated that I knew what I didn't want to do in life and hoped that I would figure out what I did want to do. But writing has always been a passion of mine, and it's always been something that, that's where I find my fulfillment, is writing. For about 15 or so years, it was writing corporate communications, which, not as fun in the sense of it's not fully creative. You do have ways to be creative, but you get a good paycheck, you get healthcare.
Mhm.
So there were a lot of benefits to that. Plus, I think I got the experience of working in a professional environment where, now I live in my world of creativity, but having had that structure and discipline, I think that was really, really important for me, just to get my own fundamental experience as what being a writer could end up being. But the reason that I left ultimately was that the partner I was working for was a very senior executive at a company called Deloitte. And he was going to retire after many, many years in the business. And he was quite a revered partner. And so I thought, I'm going to have to work for somebody else. And I just spent all these years supporting this partner. And I'm going to have to prove myself again. And I'm going to have to work all these crazy hours. And that doesn't seem as appealing as maybe, following my childhood dream of being a writer. And at the time, my kids were really young. So I thought, this could be a great time for me to retire. And so I did. And, I'm so fortunate that I have this opportunity, because I realized that, while there isn't a paycheck that comes in the mail or direct deposit, like I'm seeing rewards in many other areas. And it's just, very gratifying to be around my kids and to do what I love, and hopefully have influence on others as well. And, I get to meet interesting people like you.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful thing. Jody Lynn, I want to ask you something. We talk a lot about all kinds of stuff, but usually there's some sort of a theme about the law of attraction or self-development or something along that line, trying to solve personal problems. And very often in those conversations, we talk about the stories that we tell to ourselves and that we tell to others. But of course, the kind of stories we're talking about aren't really the same thing as a children's story or a novel or something like that. And yet, and this is what I want to ask you about, and yet there are definite overlaps between them. I mean, the kinds of stories we talk about are basically more like, here's the way I tend to talk to myself, or here's how I tend to talk to others. But I've often felt that if we could learn how to be better storytellers, in the sense of a novelist or a children's book teller or something like that, we'd actually tell better stories to ourselves. I'm wondering, where do you sit on that one? What do you think?
Yeah, 100%. Because I think a good storyteller can see the entirety of the picture. And I don't know if you'd agree with me on that, Steph, but you can see the beginning. You can see how the characters are developing and what they're thinking and why they're thinking that, and their specific position or perception of the entire scenario. And you also see all the other characters too. And I think that's the brilliance of telling a story, is that you get in depth with all of those people that are included and see the entirety of the picture. And I think that's what gets lost when we're telling our story to ourselves, like you were talking about, Walt, is we get stuck in the perception of what we see and forget that we're not the only player in this entire story, and we're not looking at the entirety of the picture. And when you take that giant step back, you see, okay, this can be funny. This can be thought of a different way. And there's so many more possibilities that exist within that context or that storyline altogether, because you're looking at it as a whole rather than that one single frame.
Yeah, great point. I love that. The greater perspective that you get from telling it as a true story. So let's go back to Steph then, because she's our resident story expert for the day. So let's say you were talking to an audience of people who were doing self-development work. They were trying to do self-improvement, and they wanted to learn how to tell better stories within that context. What would you teach them?
Well, I think that's a really tough question. I think the first thing that comes to mind, though, is to be almost in a way brutally honest with yourself. And the nice thing about being a writer is you can write everything on paper, but you don't necessarily have to share it until you're ready. And for me, the book that I wrote about was about a little girl going to sleepaway camp for the first time and hating it because she was horribly homesick. And she then finds the inner courage to power through her feelings and ultimately have a fantastic time at camp. And I think back to my motivation for writing this book, and lo and behold, it's a semi-true story. My real life story was far less dramatic and had a much slower plot. But in my book, and in real life, I was very, very homesick going away to camp. And so this process was really about self-exploration in a lot of ways for me, because I thought about, well, if I could go back in time and rewrite history, how would I do it? And, that's an interesting approach I think I would take if I were in your hypothetical seminar. I would say, let's go back in time and, how would you rewrite history and how would you approach it if you could do it all over again? And, in real life, you don't often get second chances, but I think as you look into yourself and you reflect on the past, it's really more about planning for the future and how can you avoid repeating the same path that you took that maybe you weren't so happy with how it came out. And, it's an interesting process to go through. I think for me as a writer, that's sort of what I do as I write books, and put things out in the world of how would I want to present it differently if I could? And maybe there are things that I'd actually want to continue doing the same way, and because it was a success. So it's an interesting experience just to be a writer and reflect on the life and the world as you're processing it, sometimes real time and sometimes retrospectively.
Yeah. Do you find that as you wrote that book, if you would have had, I guess, that specific perspective shift, whatever the little girl's shift is, that you may have had more of an experience like hers, like all the good stuff that came out of it?
Absolutely. I remember, and I think I was about 10 or 11 when I went to camp for the first and last time. I remember I came home from camp and I was really upset with myself because I wasted all this time at camp when, if only I had been a little bit more courageous and feeling confident that I could be independent. And I think that was really the struggle I was going through, was how could I go away to camp and leave my parents and miss them, and knowing that I'm missing them, am I being, not a bad person, but am I doing wrong by missing them and having fun at camp? So it was a really interesting challenge. And ultimately I sided with, I won't betray my parents. I'll continue to miss them the whole time. And so I was miserable. And when I came home, I was like, yeah, I shouldn't have been so miserable. I should have tried harder to make friends and get involved in the activities more, and maybe, not been so sad. Mm-hmm. And so that for me was a turning point in my introverted lifestyle where I could coast, because I was living in a house where, I was comfortable. I went to a school where people have known me for years. And so that really was sort of the impetus for me to say, you got to push yourself. You've got to be more extroverted in situations where you're not comfortable. And I think for me, overcoming some of that shyness was finding my voice as somebody who could be humorous and funny and relatable, because I can say things in a funny way that people were maybe not expecting, or in a way that people thought about but didn't necessarily process that way. So it was a terrible but amazing experience for me.
Mm-hmm. What a beautiful lesson too. Sorry. Well, nope. That lesson rings true for a lot of different things. Just the feeling bad of like, I'm missing my parents and that means that I can't have fun. I literally just had this conversation this morning. One of my best friends, her daughter's husband passed away at a very young age. And, it's been a few years since that happened. And the daughter is finally feeling better as it approaches his birthday, and feeling guilty for feeling okay. And now she's upset with herself that, she's feeling better in life and able to move through these days, but is beating herself up over it. So I think that's a beautiful lesson, a beautiful lesson to learn at such a young age, about just shifting that perspective and giving yourself that space to feel good about where you are, and that it's not like betraying your family, right?
Yeah. And I'm sure, and I know for a fact that they wanted me to have fun. So it was a really big misperception on my part that you can't do both, because you actually can. And I think, that illusion that you've just shared is like interesting, that it's such a parallel as you get older.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Jody Lynn, did you notice that when she was giving her answer at our hypothetical seminar, for people who were trying to learn how to tell better stories, that she was almost perfectly expressing a technique, a process that actually gets used by coaches. Like, go back and rewrite your history.
Oh, wow.
That's like right out of coaching.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I worked on when I was in corporate communications was corporate trainings, because I was writing some of them. Maybe I absorbed something that I was helping on, but
yeah,
I'm excited to hear that maybe I touched on something that's actually what people use in real life.
It's effective too. It's very effective, because when you can go through that exercise of rewriting history in your mind the way you wish it had played out, and in a sense leaving behind what needs to be left behind and replacing it with what puts you in a better space, it's a powerful process. It's very powerful, because first of all, you're retraining your brain. Second of all, you're also retraining your attitude, and you're doing both simultaneously. That's a combination. That's a combination that will accomplish a lot. So you hit on something really good there.
Maybe everybody should be a writer then.
I think they should.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a true power in writing. That's undeniable. But
yeah, it's literally spelling, like you're casting spells with what you're putting out there into the world. And I think that we should be more mindful of how we're writing the story, or like that brutal honesty piece that you brought up earlier. That's something that's missing a lot. I think when people are often struggling, it's because they're stuck and they're not willing to be brutally honest with themselves on all of these levels and see the story in a different way.
And it is, I mean, as I think about my writing process, like when you put something on a page, it might not be the way you want to say it ultimately, but you just put it out there. You can take it back, though. That's the nice thing about, when you're doing this drafting process. I do a lot of blogs these days, and it's funny. I was reading a blog to my mom because she's my number one fan. My husband and she and my kids might compete, but she's probably, between us, she's probably my number one fan because she's a really good listener. And she said to me, "Steph, are you sure you want to put all that personal stuff out there?" And I said, "Well, number one, it's not that personal. Like I'm a little bit private and protective of specific areas of my life. But on the other hand, I was like, but that's sort of how we all connect, is by sharing common experiences. And for me, I like to do it in a funny way. So maybe this is an even better way to connect because it makes me more approachable." And she's like, "Okay, I mean, you do what you want." And she was like, "Okay, that's your thing." But I was like, maybe she has a point. On the other hand, I do think that a lot of the relationships you develop in life are through that common bond, the commonality that you find in experience or in perspective. And, I think a lot about what I want to achieve by writing. And I think that that's probably one of the key drivers. And to do it for children where they're so impressionable, I don't have the skill to be a teacher, I don't think. And there are a lot of other areas that I probably don't have the skill set for. But writing, I think, is something I hope I do because I love it so much and I'm so passionate about it. And, I think of a quote from Mahatma Gandhi that says, "In a gentle way, you can shake the world." And so this was kind of my view on how can I shake the world and improve it and make it better. And hopefully I'm succeeding. It's all a work in process, though.
I'll beg to differ on one point. I think you actually are a teacher. In fact, in order to be a children's book author, you have to be a really good teacher, because what teaching isn't knowing a subject and explaining the subject. Teaching is diving into a collection of stories and finding the right one to explain something to somebody who's trying to learn. And that's what you do. So give yourself some credit. You're actually a pretty darn good teacher.
Yeah.
Thank you. My mom happens to be a retired teacher. I know I'm talking about her a lot today. I did recently just talk to her, so I guess she's still on my mind. But
yeah.
But it is an amazing thing to be a true teacher in such an important role in our society. Although, Walt, you alluded to not being a fan of public education, so.
Well, just because I don't like the way it's structured. I'm totally in favor of education. I just think that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for one person to be deciding for a bunch of other people what they need to learn.
No, that's a fair point. I think.
I don't think it makes any sense at all. But that's just my little thing.
But that's why it's good to have libraries where you have a lot of different perspectives that you can choose from.
Exactly. Exactly.
So there's my plug for librarians.
Yeah. And today we have all kinds of libraries available to us. Libraries that didn't even exist 30 years ago. It's just, wow.
It is incredible
Amazing.
how much information is out there. And,
Yeah.
with a little digging, you can find a whole lot.
Mm-hmm.
You also
Yeah.
have to learn to be a little skeptical too, because you have to take whatever you find with a grain of salt and say, okay, well, that's interesting. Now, how true is it?
That's true. That's true. My kids, one of my sons came home from school and told me this very wildly overestimated statistic about something. I said, "Are you sure 75, percent of all of the people in the world are this?" And he's like, "That's what somebody said in a report at school." And I said, "That's an area where I think you can do some fact checking and maybe look at a couple of other sources." And he said, "Okay." But he said it. I said, "Well, let's do a quick Google search." And then we did. And I was like, "See, there's no information that supports what your friend said. As much as I like him and I know he's a smart kid, it's just he didn't do all the work maybe." And hopefully he got a good grade on whatever assignment it was. But I'm sure the teacher hearing that 75% was like, I don't know.
It's kind of like the 80-20 rule that 80% of or 20% of the people do 80% of the work. I've never been able to find anyone who could actually document a study demonstrating the 80-20 rule, but
That's
everybody
true.
uses it.
That's true.
Yeah. I've never looked for it actually. That
I have.
That brings up a whole, spectrum of things that we take as solid gold because
Right?
the teacher said or this person said that we really believe or have a lot of trust in. And that's the 80-20 rule. I've heard that lots.
Yeah. We
I
all
have quoted it before. I have never looked for factual information that backs that up.
What I've come to realize is that the 80-20 rule is, in a sense, it's kind of like the law of attraction. It's not an actual scientific law, but it is a kind of a metaphorical way of describing how things work. So the 80-20 rule is a metaphorical way. It's not necessarily a numerical way, but it's a metaphorical way of describing how things tend to work out. And taken in that context, I think it makes total sense. But it just goes to show you got to be a little skeptical. You got to take a little skepticism to everything.
But it sounds like it's true. See, that's the other thing. Like something that sounds like definitely off. You could say, yeah, I'm going to question that. But the 80-20 rule sounds like, yeah, that sounds right. No, I'm going to agree with that one. Not going to do any more research on that.
I think it's an example of resonance. When something resonates with us, we don't really question it very much. We say, yeah, because I trust what I'm feeling inside about it. And ultimately, that's one of the things we talk about here a lot, learning to trust that inner voice, because we've had many different influences, teachers and adults and famous people who in the past have taught us, don't trust that inner voice. It's, that's the devil. That's all this horrible stuff. And we're now in an age when people are learning to trust that inner voice, and they're finding it's actually pretty darn true. It actually really is trustworthy. So I think that's part of what happens here. The 80-20 rule resonates with us, and we know that to the extent that it resonates, that for us it is true. It's got to be true because we're learning to trust ourselves.
Yeah, I think just to take on the inner voice comment, it's interesting because I think a lot about my career path and becoming a writer after working in a corporate environment. That was a really big step for me to go and just say, you're going to be fine. You're going to be good enough as a writer. You're going to be okay. And I still, struggle with, did I make the right choice? Should I have listened to my inner voice that said, go follow your passion, do something that makes you really happy and feel fulfilled? And trusting in myself, I think, may have been the scariest thing I've ever done professionally, because you don't know, there's no log that says inner voice is correct. You're definitely on the right track. There's no safety net when you say, I'm going to trust that, I'll be okay. But unfortunately, that's not true. But on the other hand, the power of positive thinking really, I think, not having any background in the science behind it, I really think, though, it really can propel you to what it is you want to achieve if you're willing to put in the work and take those necessary steps to put yourself on the path to where you want to go.
Yeah.
And that is actually something that science is starting to embrace, because we have the positive psychology movement that has emerged from the field of psychology over the last 30 years or so. And they are finding that positive thinking really does have very measurable positive results when you engage in it. So the distance between metaphor and fact is shrinking.
Well, I know, like, when I get a cold, I hate being sick. And so I tell myself, I am not sick. I don't care that I have a wad of tissues next to me. I'm not sick. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. I'm going to power through. And I find that, like, miraculously, almost every situation, I've gotten healthier faster because I refused to acknowledge that I was sick.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's science, or I just drink a lot of water and make sure that I have a lot of vitamin C, but I'm going with power of positive thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. Could be both too.
Probably a little of everything, and also time, which, you know, naturally with some common colds, they just need to work their course.
Well, I'll even throw out something a little controversial. I'll make the suggestion that science is still relatively young and is growing to the point, and I think we're kind of in the transition period now. It's growing to the point where we're going to be less dependent upon placebo-controlled double-blind studies and more oriented toward the idea that it is scientific if it is also tied into internal resonance. Now, right now, that doesn't play in the world of science, but I think we're moving there. And so I think that that boundary it's kind of blurring in a sense over time. It's going to be interesting to see exactly how it blurs, but I think that's where it's going.
Well, I think just tying it into the different avenues you can get for information, it's almost as if whatever you want science to say, you can find a way to say
Well,
it.
there's that too, yeah. I just look at I look at the fact that people will often talk about scientific proof, you know, because they're trying to make a point, they're trying to demonstrate something, show that, you know, be right about something or whatever. When in fact, science does not engage in proof at all. But look how much we have now gotten to the point where people just basically believe that scientific proof exists.
I think when you say science, you often are like, must be true.
Must be true.
80-20 rule, science said it.
That's right.
Yeah.
There was a scientist somewhere that said it, so it's true.
That's right.
Yeah, that's like the when you say people say or they say, you have to really take a second and say, well, who's they?
Who are they anyway?
These people?
We
Where
ask
are
that
they coming
question
from?
all the time. You know, who are they? They, these magical they.
And why are they hiding behind that curtain? Come out from behind the curtain.
Tell me who you are. It's so true.
All right. So we've been exploring stories from a few different angles. Let's go from a slightly different angle. You're a children's storyteller, but stories are really for everybody. I mean, I guess you could say in one sense we're all children at heart, so that's one way of expressing that we all love stories. But hey, let's be honest, we all love stories at every age.
That's
So,
true.
I mean, well, I guess this goes two possible different directions the way I'm thinking about it. First, have you ever thought about expanding beyond the children's genre? And secondly, do you find yourself in any way kind of transitioning what you do in the children's genre to just interaction with adults in your everyday life?
I think I'll tackle the have I transitioned to other genres, and I think ultimately I'm going to grow up with myself in my writing. I think sometimes, you know, I'm sort of stuck right now focusing on children because I think that's really where my heart is. And, you know, I've got my kids that are that age, and I want to populate the world with as much content as I can and have a positive influence on as many people as I can, while I still have that snapshot into their lives and that perspective on what they're seeing and what they're feeling. But, you know, I think after a while, I'll exhaust sort of the areas that I feel like I need to cover, you know, the demons that I need to work through from my own childhood and the lessons that I want to teach them. And I absolutely, you know, I think back to when I was a kid and what I was writing about, you know, in my journal, and it was terrible. First of all, I looked back at some of the stuff and I said, not only do I have bad handwriting, but the content is terrible. But you know, you sort of you kind of evolve as a person. And
Sure.
so, you know, I have to think that, you know, writing's my passion. I'm not going to give that up. And my interests will vary and change. And I think over time, who knows where I'll expand to. And, I think part of the fun of being a writer is just seeing where my brain is leading me and what messages I want to say. And, I wish I could see into the future, because I'd love to know, how successful will I be in either selling books or having an impact on people, or, just finding new paths that make people laugh. I think wherever I can do that, I absolutely would love to plug in. If there were a roadmap, I would be very happy to follow it, because I'm one of those people that will plot things out. But that's one of the scary things about living this sort of creative life too, is that there's no roadmap, and it's really wherever your creativity and your brain and your experiences can take you. But I'm happy to follow wherever they go. So we'll see. But my husband likes to joke, and he said, "You're going to have an empire of a huge body of work." And I said, "Let's hope so. That sounds great."
Yeah. It does sound great.
So we'll see. But I'm just really enjoying the process of, uncovering the gems from my past and my children's present. And it's just a really fun experience. And, honestly, the self-exploration component has been incredible, just to sort of process what I've experienced and view it from a different lens, and see how I can share my learnings with people that maybe haven't experienced the same thing or are about to experience it, and to do so in a way that helps them with whatever challenges they're about to face. It's like, wow, this is something that's a really powerful role that I never envisioned I would be playing, but here I am. And it's really very, very gratifying.
Well, I'll tell you, when I asked my question, I was actually thinking about Joe Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter series. And when you mentioned plotting out, a whole series like that, I thought, well, that's exactly what she did. She plotted out an entire 7-book series. So you're kind of right in alignment with that. But the other thing, the reason I was thinking about her was the books were written for kids, starting age around 11, 12, something like that. And yet they play so well with adults. I mean, right. I was long past being a kid when the books came out, and I devoured them because they were so enjoyable and interesting, and they just drew you right in, and like, oh, you got to know what's going to happen next with the characters and blah, blah, blah. And so I guess that's my way of saying there's a blurred line there. It's not, Joe Rowling's books aren't just children's books anymore. They've expanded into the broader literature.
There's a saying that books can be mirrors where you see yourself reflected back, or they can be windows where you're exposed to a world that's not your own. And I think, the Harry Potter series is a great example. Like, it's fantastical, yet the human element is something that's just so appealing to people of every age. And, the process of using narrative to communicate is age old, and has one of the most impactful ways of sharing stories, communicating emotions. It's, something that I rely upon, because, how else are you going to share what you want to say other than in a very interesting, captivating story? I think back to lectures that I've been in college and in law school, and the professors droning on about something. And the one thing that I found law school to be most fascinating was when there was a case that was a really interesting story. And I discovered that's what I liked about law school, were all these really interesting stories, not about what the actual law was, but, the story behind what the law was. And so I guess I've been chasing after that, and everything I do is like, where's a good story? Where's that story that really pulls you in? And, I aspire to be able to do that with my work as well. And if I can have the success of J.K. Rowling, I would not complain.
Yeah, sure. The most successful children's book author of all time. Yeah, that's a good one to aspire to. Yeah,
that sounds okay to me.
Done.
All right, sign me up. Where can I get that on paper?
Yeah.
I think back to who was the previous crown holder before Rowling came along, and I think it was probably Beatrix Potter, because she was just so successful with her Peter Rabbit series and the other children's books that she wrote, and for her time she was way ahead of all of her peers. and Joe Rowling comes along, and Beatrix Potter almost disappears in the dust by comparison. So we're talking about big leaps being taken here. So that gives you an idea of what your target is. You want to overtake Joe. You really got to overtake her.
Yeah,
I mean,
I
because
think
you identified really well what she did. She took this fantastical imaginary world of enchantment and magic
mhm.
and made it human.
Mhm.
And ultimately, I don't care what the genre is, I don't care what the storyline is. If you can make the storyline feel like real human beings behaving within whatever the constructs of that world is, you're going to make it. You're going to connect with the reader in a way that few are able to do. So I think you hit the nail on the head when you talked about that, and the fact that you like that connection so much. I mean, people give Joe Rowling so much appreciation and recognition for, well, she knows her Latin because she was able to turn that into all the spells, and she knows the history of famous stories and so forth, and she's able to tie all that in. But I don't think any of that holds a candle to what you said. I agree completely. It's about her ability to turn it into a real human story where you identify with Harry, you identify with Hermione, you identify with Ron, you identify with Draco, you identify with all those characters. They feel real. They feel three-dimensional, and they happen to be playing in a world of magic.
Right.
Mhm.
Well, I mean, think about some great American authors like Beverly Cleary or Judy Blume, who were
Mhm.
huge writing influences for me. But the thing that made them so special was they took these ordinary characters and, they made them relatable, quirky. They said things
Yeah.
that you maybe wanted to say but didn't feel comfortable doing. And that's how you really pull people in, is that these characters, they have a life that you can identify with. And I think as somebody that aspires to do that in my own work, the more you can connect with people through those characters that are memorable, that are lovable, that sometimes maybe not so lovable. I mean, you have that in your everyday existence. You
Right.
come across people, whether it's at work, at home, at school, at the supermarket, that every personality type that you can find has probably been written about in literature somewhere.
Mhm.
Shakespeare probably did it already, and then everybody's improved upon it, or
Right.
whatever
Yeah.
great writer you like.
Yeah, he kind of set the standard, but it's true. And I think the other thing that makes somebody like a Rowling so effective is not only does she show all the cool and quirky and fun sides, she also has a great ability to show the vulnerable side of a character. That's
Yeah.
that to me is the hardest part. How do you make somebody feel so real that you can actually sense where they're vulnerable? You can sense, this is where they're struggling in their own journeys in life.
Mhm.
That's what separates the great writers from the good writers, I think.
Yeah, and going back to our discussion about being brutally honest, I think about in my work, the main character is definitely a better version of me as a child, and probably as an adult as well. But
Mm.
I spent a lot of time in my earlier drafts of my book trying to refine the character, trying to make her, this perfect humorous and like sharp, like, snappy dialogue, all the TV shows that fit into 22 minutes. Like I wanted that to be my main character. And then I realized, like at draft 7 or 8, that she's not going to be perfect, and I should just relax and
Mm.
be okay with her vulnerabilities. And the fact that, I try and write about characters that aren't perfect makes them even more genuine, I think.
Right.
Mhm.
And that makes a person relatable. It makes them likable. You like being honest with your readers and saying, you know what, the world's not perfect. People aren't perfect.
Mhm.
Here's an example of somebody that falls into that category as well. And, I bet you see a little bit of yourself, maybe a lot of yourself in that person.
Mhm.
So Jody Lynn, as we're listening to this, I mean, you always process everything that we talk about on many layers, many levels. And I'm wondering if one of those levels is your coaching practice.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I love that we're talking about stories and perspective and the vulnerability piece. I think the story being captivating when you can feel that vulnerability is an important key to a good story. And I think what's so captivating about it is that you watch them go through it with maybe perhaps more or less grace, but differently than what you would have. and the outcome is good, and it kind of inspires you to take on a different perspective of things. Like, it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay not to be perfect. Like,
Yeah.
even this person right here in this beautiful book that they're talking about, she's not perfect. So it allows you to start being more of yourself. And I think there's magic in sharing that vulnerability with the world, whether it's through a story or just like this.
So if you're working with a client and you recently had this conversation with us here and we're influenced by it, do you tie it back to what you're doing with the client? Are you trying to find some way to use a story approach to help them become more vulnerable or something? I mean, I'm just kind of.
Oh, stories are my life. It's so interesting because as you were speaking, Steph, I was thinking about a conversation my dad had actually with my brother. And so my brother has a daughter and she's 11 years old. And, my brother and my family, we appreciate the family values that, my dad and my mom instilled in us, work hard and be a good person and all of these things that we feel like we learned from our parents. And so my brother was having these in-depth conversations with my dad about, how do I teach that to my daughter? Like, how do I get that message across? And he kept saying, that he can't. Like, she needs to spend more time with you, Dad. And so me and my dad are having this conversation about this secondary conversation my brother is having with him. And he said, it's really interesting because Cody says, I don't have any stories. Like, you have all of the good stories. And I looked at my dad and I said, it's because you live your life with those values. So your entire life is a story of those values. So you draw upon that. You draw upon the things that have happened in your life that encompass that value that you're trying to put on display within that story. And then people get it, they connect with it. And that's something I'm really good at doing and bring into all aspects of my coaching practice with abundance. It's all about stories, because in someone else's story we can see how we fit in and how another possibility exists. So I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, but that's where they exist, is in another story.
Well, that is what coaching is about. Coaching is helping somebody find the new possibilities and decide to go after them instead of sitting there and just kind of twiddling their thumbs and getting, all safe and comfortable in their little comfort zone.
Yeah. And I think too that we think that nobody has ever been through what we've been through. No one's ever had it like me. You don't get it. And sure, I do not get it because I have never stood in your specific shoes. I am not you, and I can't fully get your perspective. And I have been in different shoes. So I resonate with certain things, and I have stories. And I find when I tell the stories of the darkest times in my life and moving through that and seeing the hope on the other side, or seeing the magic on the other side, or just the other perspective, and it's simply how it all worked out for the better, that gives people hope of like, oh, okay, well, that seems to be, worse, better, whatever, in context to me of what I've experienced. And if they can experience hope through that, or if they can get to the other side, then I can too.
Yeah. Which is very similar to the actual telling of the story. I mean, that's Steph, when you're leading a protagonist through a storyline, that's what you're trying to do.
Right. And, going back to that inner voice, like listening to the inner voice, and at least in writing, you could give the direction to where you want that inner voice to point you. And in real life, hearing other people's stories and hearing their challenges, their experiences, you can relate, you can empathize. And, that's, I think, where I found in my own experience where I can push through to get to where I want to be, or where I should be, or where I hope to be.
So is it fair to say that writing is, among other things, self-development for you?
Without question, yes. It's the best way for me, to work through what I'm feeling, my emotions. And, I'm a very introverted person, as we've talked about. And so to do it quietly and do my own self-analysis and, be honest with myself in the comforts of my mind is a safe place for me to sort of work through a lot of things. Like I talk to friends, I talk to family, but at the end of the day, when you're sitting in the bed or lying in the bed and reflecting on things that have happened and what went well, maybe what didn't go as you planned, like it's really just you. Like there's nobody else that can really see inside yourself and make a change. And so for me, writing is the way that I can sort of organize and assess, and then share if I'm ready with the world that final product or almost final product of what I'd like the world to see.
Mm-hmm. I think
You're-
that's so beautiful. And my dad has always said to me, you come into this world on your own and you leave on your own. So you need to learn how to be your best friend. And that's something that I've incorporated not only into my life, but into coaching practices. And that sounds exactly like what you're doing, is sitting down with yourself as a friend,
Mhm.
and what's going on and how do you feel? And the detachment from having to just tell the story perfectly out loud so that someone doesn't judge you isn't
Mhm.
there. Even like the creativity that I see from like you just simply being a writing, there's no real attachment to, I have to go this direction as I unwind the story or what it meant or how it felt or whatever. You can be creative with that too. And it feels so much more freeing, like you literally have a blank page and you
Right.
can put it down and you can erase some or cross them out and change it as much and as frequently, I guess, as you want to.
Mhm.
There's power in that.
Yeah. And, life, you don't always have the final draft, when you approach an issue. And same with writing, you can refine it if you're lucky. Um, but the more that for me, I find the more that I can think about and process and plan just some of those big overarching themes of things that you experience in life over and over again, I find I'm better able to respond and react the way that my true inner self would want me to, my best friend would, versus that, reaction of no, yes, or, I'm afraid, this is
Yeah.
scary. It's not easy though, but the more that you do that work on your own, I think the better the outcome is when you may not have that final draft, to play with.
Yeah.
You got me thinking back to I wrote a book. I wrote a fiction book back in 2008, 2009, and I'm thinking about what that process was like. One of the things that comes to my mind is I don't know what your process is for writing. For me, I was trying to make a series of points, and I wanted to do it within the context of a fictional story. But then, as I started piecing together the fictional story, it got to the point. Well, first I struggled for a bit trying to figure out what my plot line was. But once
Mhm.
I had mapped it out enough, it kind of took over my awareness to the point where I couldn't get the story out fast enough. And
Mhm.
I'm wondering, do you experience that?
Yes, I am, I would say, an obsessive outliner. And I start with, those little kernels of things that I was like, oh, this will be good. This will be good. This is a character I want. This is a theme that I want. And then I keep adding to this out. It's almost like a snowflake. I think there's actually a snowflake method of outlining, which I followed, where you
Oh,
just keep building and building and building and building. And then almost, miraculously, you've got 10 pages of different versions of what you want to write about with all the details that you just pull from.
mhm.
And I tried it on the draft that I'm working on for my second book. And it's funny, it took me, I would say, one childhood and 6 years to write my first book. And I think it took like 6 weeks or so to write a first draft of my second book. So
Wow.
as
Wow.
I think about my process, it was because, first of all, I had a good idea of what I wanted to write. But also, I just relaxed and I said, just go with whatever you think will work. And if it doesn't work, you take it out. And I found that with planning ahead, I was kind of like, oh, this actually did work. It weaves the plot together just the way I was hoping. And it was a much more pleasant process, I think, also because I wasn't so worried about, what are people going to say about this book? I'm
Mm.
finally putting something out in the world. Well, for me, I've already put something out in the world, so they can say what they'd like, hopefully good things. And for this book that I'm almost wrapping up, it was such a more relaxing and freeing process because I'd done some of that homework of thinking about all the different elements that I knew I would need to include that maybe I wasn't aware of as I was writing my first book. So, it gets easier and it, in a way harder because I want to do an even better job than I did the first time. So
Sure.
nothing like putting a little pressure on myself.
Yeah, well, authors are good at that. Authors are really good at putting pressure on themselves. Yeah. It comes with the territory.
Yes, I think so. Why make it easy?
Why make it easy? Oh, yeah, let's make life as difficult as possible. But this has been a lot of fun talking about this. Now, I presume the book that's already out, that one is called, what is it?
Hurricane, like a hurricane at a camp.
Like a hurricane. Okay, got it.
Yes.
Hurricane. All right. And I presume that's available everywhere, right?
Basically, yes. Just you can probably put it into any search term and it'll come up on all the different online retailers, big names and small ones. And you can also go to my website, www.stephkatzovi, that's Steph with a PH.com, and you can find it there. But in this day of information, it's, overflowing out of computers.
Right.
So true.
And do you have a projected release date for the second book?
I want to say I'd like to finish it first and then see what happens. But I'm hoping within the next, I'd say comfortably, the next 8 to 12 months, hopefully.
Okay.
We'll see.
It's
I'll follow up
early.
with you.
It's way too early, but is there a working title?
The working title is Miss Communicamp. So I'm going on a camp theme, putting two words together. This one's about a miscommunication between two best friends. Again, like a theme that I'm sure echoes hallways of schools hourly, if not by the minute.
And adults, coffee shops,
for sure.
Yeah,
family gatherings.
Yeah, any place where people come together.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It's nice to have a skill.
Yeah.
It'll always be relevant.
It will. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, definitely, we've enjoyed that, and we'll make sure that we'll include a link to the website as well, so that make it really easy for people to find Hurricane.
Thank you very much.
This was
a really fun time. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and it was really a great pleasure to speak with you.
Well, one thing that I do want to do before we part company is something that I make a regular practice of, because you, like so many different people, are a giver, and you give and give and give. You write, you appear on podcasts, you have your blog, you're always putting stuff out to help people and keep giving. And there are many people you'll never meet, you'll never see, who have benefited from that. And you never meet them, you never see them. That's the whole point. But I think we deserve recognition for that. So on behalf of all those people you'll never meet, that you'll never see, that you've helped through your writing, of people of all ages, I just want to thank you for what you've been doing and for what you're continuing to do.
Well, thank you for that really lovely sentiment. And, I hope that for all those people that I don't meet, that I appreciate you noticing me.
Aww.
Yeah, that's part of the reason for being an author, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. But quietly, I'm not looking for attention.
That's right. Well, it's the quiet form of attention. That's what that is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's going back to Class Clown Best Sense of Humor with a Shy Person.
Yeah.
Bringing it all back to the first few minutes of our conversation. Like, I'm not looking for attention except for when I am.
Yeah. It's perfect.
So Jody Lynn, that applies to you too, right? You're not looking for attention except when you are.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
except for when I want it.
It's almost like we need to have a sign or something. Okay, attention over here.
Look at me. Stop looking. Oh my gosh, we're gonna make a sign that says stop looking.
I would love that. I'd buy a t-shirt and a sign if you're selling anything. I'll put my order in now.
I think we have a new merch line. What do you think?
Yeah, that's right.
This is a whole new industry spawned from our conversation today. That's impressive.
Wow. It's amazing what happens on this show. All right. Well, thank you, Steph, very much. We really appreciate your visit today. And Jody Lynn, as usual, thank you for all your insights. Love what you had to say as well. Thank you to our podcast listeners everywhere. We will see you all next time here on LOA Today. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
You can play now.